So here we see a confrontation with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law over the issue of eating with unclean hands. And to sum up the lesson, these leaders, these religious leaders, part of the religious infrastructure of this very religious society, they're oblivious to the miracles that God has been working through Jesus in their midst, the healings, the feeding of the 5,000 out in the desert. They're oblivious to these, and they're only noticing what Jesus is saying are inconsequential matters. He's just fed thousands of people in the desert. And not only fed them, but has fed them with abundance. Remember, the whole illustration was that what was left over? Baskets of food, right? And yet, here, these religious leaders are dithering because Jesus' disciples are eating with unclean hands. And so Jesus answers them with what we might think is a scathing rebuke of their whole tradition. And then the second part of this story that we just read is Jesus' announcement that defilement only comes from within. Defilement only comes out of someone's heart and not from someone's contact with something external. That's not, when you think about it, I think, wouldn't it be easier if we could get defiled only by things we touched? Because then what could we do? Avoid it, right?
My grandkids would love it.
And God bless them. But what I want you to do as we read this story is not to be poking fun at these misguided Pharisees and scribes, but rather trying to figure out, how does this story apply to me? Like Susan says, how am I like the Pharisees and the scribes, and maybe don't even realize it? So, who are these Pharisees and scribes? We've talked about them before a little bit, but they regard themselves as the keepers of the tradition, the keepers of the religious tradition of the Jews. They're not part of the political power structure. They don't run things. When you hear about the Sadducees, now they are a political party that are aligned with the Romans and the Herodians, who are the ruling powers. They're kind of the powers that be. The government itself is, under the Romans, is a group called the Sanhedrin, which is how many people, Susan? Is it 72 or 74? 71? I think there's 71 people who are in this, like we might call it the Congress, and they're made up of different parties. And there are some Pharisees that are in the Sanhedrin. And in fact, some people think that Paul, before he was converted to Christ and was a Pharisee, was maybe part of the Sanhedrin because he had come from kind of a elitist family and so forth. But they made decisions that affected everyone. But the Pharisees were this, I would call them hyper-religious, we might call them self-righteous keepers of the tradition. They publicly call out Jesus here, and they protest how come your disciples aren't following the rules? The rules about unclean hands. And there's a little bit of a jibe that Mark throws in. He says that says that these teachers are from Jerusalem. Remember, right now they're out in the countryside, or what we would call a little bit of the podunk area of Israel. They're in Galilee. People up there, I guess it's kind of like being from the Ozarks. They have a little bit of a funny accent. Remember, the people at the trial identify some of Jesus's followers by their accent. Although geographically to us, it's not that far of a distance, but there aren't any highways, so people couldn't travel too far on foot each day. But the Pharisees were concerned with people maintaining purity. I guess it's kind of like, I mean, I don't know, don't quote me on this, but you hear about in Iran, these people who go around with switches and hit ladies behind the legs if they're wearing something that's a little bit too risque. So to them, Jesus has a cavalier attitude towards tradition. And obviously, if people didn't continue to need to come to them for advice on what was proper, then they would lose their importance in society, because their importance is to help people keep to the straight and narrow, as they defined it, or as tradition defined it. And so in this passage, we're dealing with the issue of defilement. The disciples were eating with unclean hands, which is opposed to eating with food and hands devoted to God. In other words, to be Jewish, one of the things that separated you from all of these pagan Gentiles right around you was that you washed your hands, you washed your cups, you washed your vessels. Well, if Jesus undermines that, then in a small way, maybe, there are, of course, probably bigger ways, but in this particular way, he's undermining, he's redefining what it means to be in a right relationship with God. Because the Jews, of course, would say that who is in a right relationship with God? They were. But in order to be in that right relationship, these are the things you had to do. Jesus doesn't try to justify his disciples. He doesn't say, well, he doesn't make an excuse for them. He doesn't say, well, in this particular case, they're correct. He doesn't try to argue the point, does he? What does he do?
Points out it's irrelevant.
He kind of vilifies his challengers. And he says, in fact, that Isaiah, who was a great prophet, it was Isaiah, I think, around 600 BC, before the Assyrian conquest, when the Assyrians, took the Jews off into slavery. He says, Isaiah told us about what you guys were going to be like. Isaiah prophesied about you. He prophesied that there would be hypocrites who cleverly swap their own words, what they had determined over time to be the rules, for God's original commands. And so by this point in time, 600 years later, they interpreted the rules as, okay, if you wash your hands, you can be close to God. But Jesus says, no, in fact, you all have drifted away from God. God doesn't care about your lip service. He's not caring about whether you wash your hands in precisely the right way at precisely the right times, or your cups and your saucers. He cares, and he's going to explain this to his disciples, only about a person's morality, which comes out of a pure heart, not clean hands. Now remember, for the Jews who weren't up to the same anatomical education that our doctors here would be, they thought that the heart was the source of thoughts and actions and desires, not just a pump. Yeah.
You say that, but it isn't part of the Jewish tradition, obviously, not being say pork and things like that, by eating those uncooked or not thoroughly cooked food, is not good for you. I mean, in sip and whatever. I mean, is there any tie-in into that in terms of, hey, unclean hands and hey, not being hygienic about this?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, there is a tie-in here, but it's not the point. The point, the original rules were given, like what were some of the other rules besides pork? What was, huh?
Stations.
No crustaceans, no,
No mixing.
animals that were on the bottom of the ocean floor, what scavengers, and some people would say, well, that's probably because through folk medicine and so forth, they had learned by thousand. The law was written. All these rules and regulations were written like 1000 BC. That it did serve to maybe make things a little healthier for the people, no question about it. But what it had come to mean was that this is what you have to do in order to be obeying the rules. And if you obey the rules, unlike these people that are living outside your area, you can be close to God. And
you're obeying the rules instead of making a decision.
Instead of what? Yeah, and how would you follow the Lord? So the Pharisees are trying to publicly shame Jesus and saying, you're not making your disciples follow the rules and regulations. But he says that they have this superficial religiosity that permits one to transgress God's direct commands. And what does he cite as an example? He cites this extreme example. In the law, in the Torah, in the Old Testament, it's one of the 10 commandments is honor what? Honor your mother and father, so that, nobody memorize that? So that your days may be long upon the earth. And anyway, God commands in the 10 commandments that you honor your father and mother. I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty here, but because I wish I had done more to honor my father and mother when they were here, as opposed to being a rebellious jerk. Okay, so it says, Jesus is saying, okay, you know the law, honor your father and mother. But what you're doing is that instead of honoring your parents by showing them respect and providing them with their necessities of life when they're in their old age, there wasn't a social security system, there wasn't anybody had an IRA, so your children were expected, and God wanted you to take care of them who had taken care of you. But the Pharisees would allow them to duck this requirement by saying that what they might have given to their parents, they're going to tithe to the church. In other words, they say, oh, look, I would give this to you, but I'm going to give this to the church, and that's more important because that's giving it directly to God. Because korban means dedicated to God. I'm going to give the money to God's work, not take care of you. Anybody have any questions about that? This is an example. This is an example he pulls out. So he exposes these teachers as more interested in legal, and by the way, this idea of korban in the 1,000 years since this law had originally been put down in writing. The Ten Commandments themselves are a pretty simple document. Heavy, but simple. Well, in 1,000 years, there have been all kinds of instances that have come to fore, which is, okay, well, I see, here's my situation. I'm not sure, how do I apply the Old Testament to that? I mean, the Ten Commandments to that. And people would go to the scribes and the Pharisees and says, look, here's my situation. And so this simple Ten Commandments had become thousands and thousands of written and unwritten traditions and laws. And so if you were the keeper of that library, you'd say, oh, here's what tradition says. Jesus is saying that they're more interested in these legal niceties, these details that have come up over time, than God's clear requirement to love your parents and honor them. He's saying that they've become more committed to these unwritten or these traditions that have been developed rather than the written Ten Commandments, the law. They're more concerned with property because, see, if you say, well, I'm going to give this to God in my estate. Well, what does that mean? That means you're going to enjoy the benefit of your property while you're alive. It's going to go to the synagogue or to the system after you're dead. That's nice. All of us would like each other to leave property to God. But in the meantime, have you taken care of your parents? Let's look at verses 14 through 23 again. Where did we stop on the reading? Sue, did you read some? Okay, let's start again. Let's reread chapter beginning of verse 14. Sue, would you begin there? In fact, you can read the whole thing.
Again, Jesus called the crowd to him. Listen to me. Understand this. Nothing outside the person follow by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of the person.
Go all the way through 23.
Okay. After he left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing enters a person outside and follow them, for it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body? In saying this, Jesus declares all foods are clean. He went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is within and a person's heart that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from the inside and defile the person.
Well, now it's starting to get a little bit personal. I mean, it might be easier if you could just wash your hands and floss your teeth and be right with God. But Jesus rejects this whole approach. He's concerned about internal purity. And internal purity can't be created simply by washing your hands. Jesus says that true holiness, and holiness isn't saintliness. What does holiness mean? What does holy mean? Separate. So being devoted to God. holiness. All of us want to be more separate from these other adjectives. True holiness that imitates God is internal. Well, the disciples are puzzled. They've grown up in this society which honors all of these little teachings of the scribes and the Pharisees. But Jesus further explains to them, he says, the only way you can be defiled, the only thing you need to worry about has to do with your heart, not your hands. You need to be worried about the evil thoughts that are leaking out from within. Has anybody had any evil thoughts lately? Evil thoughts that leak out from within, you need to worry about, not food that's going to end up what? In the toilet.
Okay,
Huh?
and you describe evil.
I think right here, he's going to get a good listing of it. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness. And I was reading that lewdness, and I've been reading on the news about that. What's that? What's Florida trying to, that only fans? I don't know, the website that, anyway, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. Well, I think all of us can relate to some of those. What does not enter the heart does not make a person unclean. How one handles food does not make one unclean. It's internal purity that matters to God. I know my wife's taking care of the cleanliness in my kitchen and my food. The stuff that's bubbling up within me, that's what I need to worry about. Jesus doesn't, he's not rejecting tradition as such. Remember, he goes to all the holy days. He goes to the synagogue to worship. He goes to church. But the tradition can't replace God's word. We need traditions. You know, what's another word for tradition? And I didn't come across this till I was studying it. But you remember the parable about the wineskins, putting the new wine into old wineskins? Wineskins are traditions. Traditions are wineskins. They're necessary, but they can become old and brittle. And traditions become evil when they run counter to God's purposes. They become corrupt when people are more concerned with keeping them than obeying God's direct commands. Honor your father and mother, not weasel your way out by some kind of a tax maneuver that lets you enjoy your estate while you're here. In fact, in Exodus, remember the 1,000 years earlier, it only required priests engaged in the tabernacle service to wash their hands. But the Pharisees' tradition over the 1,000 years had extended this to everyone and to all food, not just that which was offered as an offering. So Jesus labeled these laws and these traditions. He says, these are the traditions of men. The tradition of, but think about this, the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees, even as arcane and as elaborate and as complex as all these written traditions were. And it did take a guy that was a professional to help you interpret it for your own life. It was actually kind of nice from a human perspective because it just required that Israel be separate from outsiders, and that you, if you follow these rules, you could consider yourself holy. I mean, they wanted to be obedient to God, but they didn't think that they were voiding the commands of God. They were trying to give lay people, me and you, a map to live a life of godliness. And they were also trying, incorrectly, to deter pagan influencers who were all around. Remember, they were, I mean, within 2 miles, there were all kinds of Greek gods and Roman gods and pagan gods. They were trying to keep themselves separate. They wanted to insulate Israel from the Greco-Roman culture that surrounded them. But in fact, what had God, if one were to ask, if Ken was a Pharisee and someone would approach him and a layperson, a shepherd came, how do I approach Almighty God? Well, Ken would say, well, you got to wash your hands. But what had God said through David in the Psalms? It says, you approach God with a clean hands and a pure heart. But what precisely is one to do? The rabbis would say that when one eats, one is approaching God's throne in gratitude, and one must wash his hands. You must hold the wine in the right hand and the cup and the oil in the left hand, and in doing it, one shall know that there are rules, and if I follow these rules, then I'm reverent, and that I'm mindful of being in God's presence. This is how I can concretely show my devotion to God. If I stay within the boundaries, I'm okay. And if I question where the boundaries are, all I have to do is go make an appointment with Ken and he'll straighten me out because that's his study. But Jesus says he is attacking their boundaries. He's saying that true uncleanness is a moral deficiency, not a ritual deficiency. Does this make sense? God's holiness bursts all bounds. God's holiness, you can't make God be contaminated by your unclean hands. God's holiness, through a pure heart, you're coming closer to God, then it transcends everything else. Jesus displays his power when he touches a leper. Remember, it was against the rules for you to touch a leper. He touches a leper. He touches a corpse. It was against the law to touch a corpse, probably stemming from way back when, or when you could get a disease from touching a corpse. Well, that may be natural law, but as far as making you clean or dirty, it doesn't. What else did he do to transcend one of these laws very recently? He touched this lady. What was the lady's problem? She had a flow of blood for 12 years. That was, in effect, she was kicked out of society because no one could touch her. Okay, so let's try to translate like this a little bit to our church, our not necessarily the village community church, but maybe the churches you grew up with. Let me give you an example that occurred to me. So I grew up in the Bible Belt, in the 50s and 60s. And I was in this tall steeple establishment church. It was like, I mean, like affluent area of the city I lived in. And it was like 4,000 or 5,000 members. And I never saw anybody that didn't go to church. If you went out of my driveway on Sunday morning, everybody's getting in their car and everybody had a coat and tie on. I mean, from 5 years old, everybody had a coat and tie on. You didn't go to church without being dressed up. The wives were all dressed up, dresses on. And we were white, shiny faces, and we went to church. Okay. And we thought we were in a right relationship with God. I'm translating this from a kid's perspective, but we thought, well, this is how you're right, how you do right. So around 1967 or 8, some black people showed up at our church. And they weren't let in. And then some black people showed up. You know, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, same town. A lot of racial uprisings. We were taught in school, well, they want to be separate. Everything we should have separate but equal, right? Of course, if you went to the separate but equal schools, they didn't look quite equal. But we were taught that was the way it was. I mean, I'm a white kid. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm sitting there in my coat and tie and I'm in church. So then, under pressure, they let in some black people, but they had to go to the balcony of the church. Then about half the church quit the church, went 3 miles down the street near where Susan lived, and set up a different Presbyterian church. No black people allowed. So as I was studying this, it became really clear to me that that's a very simple example of how all of us in that church were washing our hands, but what was coming out of our hearts. So what I'm asking you is, it doesn't have to be an extreme example like that, but does this parable of Jesus or this teaching of Jesus ring true in your own life? Or do you feel like, oh my gosh, I really thought I was concentrating on the small things to get right with God and forgetting the major thing?
Church and had great flannel shorts, stars and white shirt, collar was scratching like crazy. Had a little tie on, and knee-high white socks.
In Canada.
Hard shoes. But we go to church, and I remember coming out and my grandmother and my aunt, after going to church with me, then talking about, you see so-and-so, they bought this new car, something, and they're talking down about it. So they went into church, sort of washed their hands, came out and spewed things from their heart, jealousy, envy, a whole bunch of things. And I really turned off the church because it was so.
You were aware of that.
I also was with it. I took it to my father, and I would sit the back row and play tic-tac-toe on the program. And so I was getting nothing out of church, and so I don't know either. But it was the same for me. You go there with the intention of cleansing your heart, but you come out. I came out with hearing things in the community that completely turned me off. From the people turned me off. My own family. But this is more societal type of things. You know, where we're sitting today, wasn't that long ago, Jews or blacks were not allowed to represent. You know, where I grew up, you know, Jews were not allowed in the city. Much larger environment than some of the things we're talking societal types of things that, directly affect the sub-classifications, if I can call that, and those are the things that needed to be changed.
Okay,
And changing small steps, no question about it, to change society. But anyway.
well, the reason you know all the rules about Rancho Santa Fe is because you were president of the board, and you probably had to look at that covenant at one time. But there were, what do they call those, yellow lines or green lines, or there were areas where you couldn't have, red lines. Susan?
Just answering your question, another illustration.
Yeah, sure.
So Ken and I grew up Catholic. And so we had an exact illustration of this ceremonial hand washing, because every single time we went to church, they would have mass, which is communion, that's the most significant thing, not the preaching of the word, as it is in our Presbyterian church, it's the mass, that reenactment of the sacrifice of Jesus at the Last Supper. And the priest has a garment on and everything, because it's holy, it's supposed to be holy, he's acting out this important symbolism up here on the altar, and they have a pitcher of water, and they rub it over his hands into a basin, and there's a little towel. There's no soap. He's not washing his hands. He's doing a ceremonial illustration. Not one time in my whole life did someone say, you wash your soul or your thoughts or your, what this means. You know, especially as a little kid, I think that's a really sorry hand washing. That's what he's doing. He's like, really, you get it done. And so that leads me to think, well, what is all the Pharisees are doing is they're trying to make a contract with God. They're trying to make a contractual relationship. And if I do this, I'm in. You'll take me. I'm in. I'm good. And so if you wash your hands, and if you do this, and you do that, and you do this, you do that, and it can be really elaborate contractual relationship, then you know that you're clean, you're good, you're in. And my dad, who was Methodist, became a Catholic. He married my mom because she had to be Catholic. And my dad I became a Christian at 16, and my dad said to me, he said, Susan, you know why I really like the Catholic Church? Why? Because I was by then moved past that into more heartfelt kind of worship things. And he said, because you keep the 10 Commandments. If you keep the 10 Commandments, you're good. And see, it was a contract. And that's what these Pharisees are so threatened by. Is, wait, we have a contract with God. What do you mean it's not a good contract? I've got it all. I know how to do this. Don't you come tell me it's not right. Because everything Jesus did was he prayed on the Sabbath, heal on the Sabbath, touch dead bodies, touch corpses. And then he says in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, if you have pain in your heart, you just kill somebody. If you have lust in your heart, it's the same thing. So he's breaking down all of your contracts, and they just pay him for it. And then that goes back to me. What am I doing that makes me think, well, I've done this and this and this and this? So right, I'm good, right?
That's why I came here. This covers me for the day. So I'm telling it.
Well, so I think we get
Well, no,
the message.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On verse 6, it says Isaiah prophesied correctly. Now, was that in the Old Testament? Were the leaders aware of that statement regarding the hearts of man and etc.? Were they aware of that statement that's quoted in our Bible? Was this something that?
Yeah, it was the written Isaiah, the written book of Isaiah was definitely part of.
So that was not, I was just trying, that's not an unspoken or an unknown.
Right,
to the.
right, it's just ignored. So, I mean, I think you guys get the gist of the message here, that Jesus made, what matters to Jesus is what comes from inside you. And, some churches even today, and I'm not saying ours isn't, but some churches today, for example, some churches have really rigid rules about infant baptism versus adult baptism. Well, it probably didn't mean, who is baptized as an adult? Okay, well, and that's okay with me. I'll accept you in our church. No. But no, certain churches, you have to be baptized a certain way or it doesn't take. Okay, well, clearly that looks like even the most obtuse of us can think that looks hypocritical. But the song that we used to sing, they'll know we are Christians by our love. The issue is, do we live that way? Do we live that out? Is our heart in it? Because we too can be correct in outward form, going to church, definitely going to go on Christmas and Easter. Definitely I can say the Apostles' Creed, but is my heart in it, and is what coming out of my heart acceptable to Jesus? Goodness comes from inner purity. That's what this lesson's about. Is there anything else anybody wants to? Susan, you wanted to add anything to that? Sue Bien, did you want to add something to that? Do you believe that?
I do believe that.
You do believe it. Good. I don't mean to, I think all of us agree with that. Now we just got to go out and live it, right?